Hi, hopefully you guys can hear me. My name is Suri Crowe, and I'm a freelance journalist and writer. I live currently in Virginia Beach, and I'm grateful to be a part of the People's Filibuster for Gun Safety. I really liked what that last presenter said about we have got to muck up the system. We have to make changes because we cannot continue as we are. So I'm going to give you a story about my connection to gun violence, which goes back to my very earliest childhood and has woven its way throughout my life, both personally and professionally. I pray that the people who need to hear our stories are hearing them because I do not want to be preaching to the choir anymore. And we do know that 90% of Americans want some type of gun reform law passed. So Congress, it's we the people, for the people, by the people. Let's listen to what the people are saying. So I grew up in Arizona as the daughter of the only pediatric surgeon in Southern Arizona at the time. My dad was the go-to guy for childhood trauma cases, often the surgeon to be called after kids landed in the emergency room as their only chance for survival. My dad could not save every child, and he lost many little patients to illness and to trauma, and each life lost gutted my father. I remember him being morose and sad and having nightmares. I remember my dad putting up a bumper sticker, gun control now, on our white Pontiac sedan. And I asked him why one day. And he explained to me that he had been taking care or been called to treat kids who had gotten a hold of a loaded firearm inside of their parents' or an adult's home. And these kids, thinking it was a toy, had shot either themselves or a sibling or a playmate. And my dad just could not get his head around this. As someone who had devoted his life to saving children, he couldn't understand how something so preventable could just be allowed. And it really bothered him. And so he became very vocal about the need for stronger gun reform laws. And I remember one particular case where dad came home just heartbroken and from the hospital one night, grief stricken. He'd been called to a case where um, a father, having heard noise in his bedroom in the middle of the night, became alarmed and reached for his loaded gun at his bedside table, if I recall. And his little child, his little boy, I don't remember the age because this is just a story that my dad was telling me, 3, 4, maybe 5 years old, had wandered into his parents' bedroom. So the dad, thinking that he would disable the intruder, but wouldn't kill a person, aimed for the floor. And what he tragically didn't understand or realize was that when he aimed at the floor, he shot his little boy in the abdomen and chest. My dad was called in for emergency surgery, but at that point, on a tiny little body like that, it was too much damage, and that child died. And I remember my father just being so bothered by that. So my dad would often say to me after taking care of these childhood victims that guns are made for one thing only, and that is to kill somebody. And as a Harvard trained pediatric surgeon, my dad became very vocal about the need for stronger gun control measures. So let's jump ahead several years. I'm in college in Dallas. During my junior year of college one night, I walked out of my sorority house with a sorority sister to go somewhere. I have no idea where we were going. And as we walked to the parking lot, I remember somebody coming up behind me and grabbing me like in a chokehold. And I lived next to a bunch of the guys in the football team at the time, and I thought somebody's just like, pulling a rank one, just joking around. Until I felt something against my temple, and I heard a voice say, "Give me your money." I realized right then that it was not a joke, that it was definitely not my football player buddies. And I will never understand how I wiggled out or dropped out of that chokehold, but I did. And when I did drop out of it, I was looking down the barrel of a gun. It was a surreal moment for me. I realized that, I was in extreme danger at that moment. And I remember the feeling of not being able to get my legs to run. I just knew I had to run. It's so true in moments like that. Time slows down. It's like seconds become like, I don't know, hours. And so I remember just thinking, you've got to run, you've got to run. So I was running back towards the sorority house and thinking, should I zig? Should I zag? Because he's going to shoot me. He's going to shoot me. And just that feeling, I always remember that feeling of just like, oh, that protective feeling of trying to avoid being shot. Um, my girlfriend she could get her vocal cords to work. She screamed. And that was what caused the guy to turn his attention away from me. I just couldn't vocalize. I'm one of those, I guess, freeze type of folks at certain times. I pounded on our sorority house door until somebody opened the door, God bless them. And we both made it in. The cops came and investigated the case and said it was likely somebody looking for drug money in a wealthy neighborhood, which is where my college was at the time. So I forgot about that incident for years because at the time, nobody really made a big deal about it. But our brains file away trauma in very specific categories. And years later, my slow motion nightmare, I would recall it in one of the most horrific ways. So I pursued a career in television news and went from my home in Southern Arizona to South Texas and finally Virginia. Obviously, as a reporter, you're called to violent crime scenes all the time. That's just part of the job. And after nearly 20 years in the business, I've lost count of how many gun homicides, domestic murder suicides I've covered, gun-related crimes, accidents, robberies, Mexican bloodbath cartels, you name it, I've seen it, I've been there. So quite a bit of gun violence. And I remember distinctly interviewing the Brownsville police chief after a domestic violence dispute had escalated into a murder homicide situation. And I will always remember his words. He looked at me and he said, once a gun is introduced into the situation or the mix, the entire chemistry and potential outcome is changed in a far more violent direction. And this was years ago in the 90s. And I remember him saying that, it just rang in my head. Here was this, police chief saying that guns are something that we as police officers recognize as a game changer in these situations. So I ended up in Virginia years later. I covered stories on the gun show loophole, the boyfriend loophole, the meaninglessness of restraining orders when a perpetrator shows up at a woman's house with a firearm or several. On and on and on this went. After the Republicans revoked the assault weapons ban, which was in 2004, I was frequently called out to scenes that involved high-powered assault-style weapons. And I remember one morning before we were working on the morning show, that always seemed to be my jig, my photographer and I set up an early morning live shot after a gang violence incident. And I looked down and found myself walking through human brain matter. And I just said, this is crazy. My live TV, I'll always remember that, looking down and seeing the cords to the live truck wrapped in human brain matter. And I know this is graphic, but this is the result. This is what happens with gun violence. And it just struck me that this is a war zone. This is like operating in a war zone. So moving ahead, I covered the aftermath of the Virginia Tech massacre and spent hours interviewing and getting to know several of the tech victims and their family members. And they advocated for stronger gun laws here in Virginia, which is a very red, very gun pro state. And I'll always remember these families and the victims begging the Republican governor at the time for just incremental changes in the gun laws. They were specifically asking for there to be a limit on the number of firearms that a person can make per month to prevent arsenal piling, because like, how many guns a year do you need to buy, And even after one of the most deadly massacres in American history, that was not enough to move the Virginia legislature to give that one little measure to the families of Virginia Tech. And I remember looking at their faces after hearing their stories for so many, hours, and I felt saddened and defeated for them. And it was a realization that if tech isn't enough to move the needle for stronger gun laws, then I'm not sure what will be. And that was before Sandy Hook. Jump ahead to August of 2015. I was now working as a reporter in Central Virginia. And I frequently worked the morning shift again. And I had gotten to professionally know one of the morning show reporters there and her photographer. We weren't close friends, but we covered similar stories. We did live shots kind of standing next to each other. And her name was Allison Parker, and her photographer's name was Adam Ward. At the time, in 2015, all of the stations were doing a big run-up to prepare for the 50th anniversary of Smith Mountain Lake, which is a man-made lake in Central Virginia. And it was just, I don't know, something that we were covering, particularly on the morning show. And I remember flipping on the news one morning before my day shift. A day shift in news talk means you're working the 9 to 7 shift. I was eating breakfast in my living room. And it was just strange that I had the inclination to turn on the news that morning, but I was like, let me see what's going on with my competition. And when I looked at DBJ, I saw the general manager, a man by the name of Jeff Mark, show up on the anchor set. And I was like, my gut just went off. Something is really wrong here. And I could see the looks of panic on the anchors' faces. And I was like, whoa, something's going down. Well, what was revealed when the general manager got on the station, the anchor desk that day, was that they believed that they had lost their morning news crew to a shooting. The details were fresh. Cops were en route to the scene. They weren't sure, but something very, very bad had happened. And what had happened is that as Allison Parker was interviewing a woman by the name of Vicki Gardner, who was if I'm correct, I think she was the head of the Chamber of Commerce for Smith Mountain Lake that morning, and Adam, her photographer, was shooting. When I say shooting, I mean with a camera. And they were standing there in the dawn of the early morning hours, as you do when you work that morning show shift. It would be considered a very, I mean, of all the places I've done live shots from in just war zones and danger zones, you would think that an early morning live shot on a pristine lake would be one of the safest places you could be. But what had happened is that in the middle of this interview on live TV, loud noises were heard, and Adam's camera dropped mid-interview. Nobody at the time knew what was happening. There were loud noises, of course, and what had happened is had essentially stalked them to this live shot location. He had planned it, and he'd come up behind Adam and shot him. I think it was in the head, excuse me. So Adam Ward dropped, as did his camera at the time, and Allison recognized the shooter because she had worked with him at one point, and she heard the gunshots and flinched and ran for her life. Vicki Gardner, the interviewee, she did survive by laying in fetal position, and a stroke of God, I have to say. So all this to say, I was called into work because this is a huge breaking story. I get chills even recounting that day. Whew. And chaos was breaking out in our newsroom. I mean, we had crews going all over the place. This was a massive story. I know I was in some type of shock because I knew Allison and Adam. I was the only person at my station who actually had any connection to them, really, just because of similar shifts we worked. So I was sent out to chase the gunman down across the state of Virginia with my photographer. And as we made our way north of Charlottesville, I was looking, as you do when you're a reporter, for the very latest information on a story, like we were listening to radios trying to follow. The Virginia State Police were chasing the gunman. He had fled the scene of the crime and was fleeing. And so my producers and bosses had sent me to go pursue him. So that's what we were doing. And I saw on Twitter that the shooter, whose name I don't want to remember or name, had uploaded a video to Twitter. It was about a minute long. And I watched it. And I will never be able to unsee what I saw. It was his first person perspective, using his phone, I guess, as he walked up behind Adam Ward that day and held the gun there for seconds before any of them noticed. And the video was of Allison Parker running for her life from the shooter. And even though at this point I knew that my colleague, again, to be clear, we worked at different stations, but I knew logically she was dead. But when I watched that video and saw her screaming, I screamed, "Run, Allison, run." And that day when I was running from the guy who had held me at gunpoint came racing back. It's just instinct, it's survival. And I remember thinking, run, 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 which she did. But she didn't survive. She ran into a corner of a restaurant and a walkway that I was very familiar with at Smith Mountain Lake. And he shot her, I think, multiple times in the chest and head. And she died there in that corner. And I saw enough of the video that just has permanently seared itself in my brain. That video was quickly taken down by order of state police and investigators, and I don't believe it has ever resurfaced. I thank God that her father and family members did not have to see that, or hopefully Adams or anybody else. The rest of the day was a blur, police car chases. I was in a state of shock, not able to quite process the fact that someone that I knew and worked with had been killed so violently, and her photographer. I ended up in Northern Virginia where the shooter had crashed his car, which I watched him do, and he killed himself by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So there was a scrum of us all covering the story. Now national media is on it. I was up in just in Northern Virginia. And I remember the weight of that day just coming down on me. The morning, eating my breakfast or whatever it was, and just the cold chill I felt when I saw that something had gone awry with someone I knew, someone who does something that I did every day, go out, do a story, report it on live TV. And I remember just collapsing in the middle of this scrum of reporters, thinking, I have to cover this story. This is my job. I have to cover their murders. But the magnitude and the PTSD of my own experience was just, I didn't have the capacity to understand how deeply dysregulated my nervous system was. In the years since that's happened, I've done a lot of work and really tried to get healthier. And I really hadn't even revisited this day until I was asked to take part in this People's Filibuster, because I want people to understand how awful it is. And if news crews can be sitting by a lake, just interviewing somebody from the Chamber of Commerce and be gunned down on live television, or our babies in schools, I mean, we know that it happens everywhere. And even as a seasoned veteran reporter who has shown up at so many insane scenes, this was just, it was too much. And we do know that gun violence trauma is cumulative. Even if you've never personally been held at gunpoint or have lost a family member or a friend or a loved one, just seeing this constantly all of the time, and it's just increased. We know since 2020, we now have more children dying from gun violence in our active duty military. This is crazy. This is not the kind of country that I want to live in. And I cannot understand how anybody could rationalize this because of their fixation with guns. I think about the Virginia Tech families who pleaded and begged for something to change, and it didn't. I think about if there had been a red flag law for the person who killed Allison and Adam, maybe that would have prevented him from accessing firearms and the magazines he had. And I just remember the ensuing days, because this was such a big story. Everyone came to Central Virginia, and the trauma. When I would be sent out at all hours of the day to pursue this story, suddenly I was looking up on buildings. I was looking for guns everywhere. I was so scared, and at the time I had a stalker of my own, and I went to station management and said, I want to make sure that I'm protected. But what do you do in a country where people can so easily and legally access guns? And I think that's an important part. We have to really pay attention to the facts of what's happening in America, is that this person was able to legally access the firearms that killed my friends and colleagues. The Uvalde shooter was, the Buffalo shooter, on and on and on and on it goes. So whenever I hear this thing about, but law-abiding citizens, well, these people were considered by our current law as abiding, and they were able to legally access weapons that wiped out groups of people and have irreparably damaged the lives. I mean, I became friends with Allison's boyfriend and her father because I was talking to them so regularly, and that trauma is just never going away. I think about the families in Uvalde, even long after the news crews leave and the SAT trucks get out, these families are left with the damage and despair of what has happened and the people they love being taken away from them. And just in my own experiences with this, how it comes back again and again. So I went to the very first March for Our Lives to cover it 4 years ago in 2018. I interviewed several of the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland. I remember seeing the trauma on their faces, but that they had a hope that something was going to change. They were marching on Washington. This was it. David Hogg was there, X Gonzalez. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. Our kids are now getting out here because we adults we're not doing anything. We're not helping. We're not saving them. And then here we are back at Uvalde, back at Buffalo. And I returned to DC about a week ago, 4 years later, to write about the March for Your Lives, but also really to go at this point as an activist, because how many times in my own life, and I'm not even recounting the Virginia Beach shooting that happened here, or that my hometown Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot in a grocery store very close to my home. I mean, everybody in this country, if you haven't been touched by gun violence yet, I guarantee you, you will. You will, because we have more guns than people. And so anyway, moving along to this March for Our Lives story, or a rally, I arrived, as you do as a reporter, I get right up close to the stage. And after most of the speakers had spoken, and all this time through my head, I kept thinking, this is the perfect place for somebody who disagrees with any kind of gun reform law to come here with a high-powered assault rifle, and it would be like shooting fish in a barrel. And the whole time I was there, I was like, I just had this like creepy feeling like, gosh, this is, I don't know. So we held a moment of silence for the 78 minutes that the babies in Uvalde and their teachers had to wait for police officers to rescue them. And we know now, I mean, this is something that I cried days and days. And again, today we hear the head of the Texas State Police saying that this was just a complete failure. So 78 minutes go by. So much for the armed guys, so much for the good guys with the guns, did nothing in that situation. So we were holding a moment of silence for the Uvalde massacre victims. And seconds into it, and I'm right at the stage, and this is in DC at the big march, 40,000 people, I hear gunshot. Someone just yelled the word gunshot, and there was a loud pop. And I am telling you what, survival instinct is stronger than even my tough reporter's gut, because that old tape, that old thing that had happened to me in college that was replayed when I watched the video of my colleague being hunted down, there it was again, go, run. And I remember running over the crowd. And I remember seeing just hundreds of people in the near vicinity, because we were all up on the monument. I saw people just falling like dominoes. Just gut instinct kicks in, and people were either running like I was, or I saw parents just covering and shielding their children. It's just to see the trauma as I was running. Again, it felt like slow motion. I was looking at all these bodies just folding, and not knowing if there was somebody with a high-powered assault rifle with an AR-15. None of us knew. It turned out it was just a scare. But the trauma that I saw playing out in real time with people who are gun violence survivors who were marching in DC to demand change. Just in that moment alone, this guy who was arrested and detained, I went back and found him, and I just was so angry that somebody could do that. But the thought that we live in a country where it's that possible for somebody to just roll up on the Washington Monument with a legally purchased AR-15 and just mow people down because they're having a bad day. I saw kids quivering. I myself, my whole PTSD was kicking in. I was like, God, I got to get it together. I got to get back to the stage. And but just the trauma, the cumulative trauma that gun violence leaves on us collectively as Americans. And here we were 4 years later, and nothing had changed. And you could see the despair in the faces of these Parkland, these Parkland high school survivors. David Hogg, God bless him, up there preaching, but just to hear of the damage and the PTSD, and that we as adults we failed them, was really hard to take. So all that to say, um, I was supposed to spend the weekend in DC, but I was so traumatized by this incident at the March for Our Lives, I had to come back home. And my entire nervous system had been dysregulated like all week. And this is when you realize the trauma that replays itself out every single time there's another shooting or a massacre. So every time somebody is killed by gun violence, Allison Parker's and Adam Ward's family are re-traumatized. Every time there's a school shooting, these wonderful parents and colleagues of the Sandy Hook teachers and kids are having to relive it. Uvalde is another Sandy Hook day for them. And we collectively haven't done anything. And so the reason that people like me, somebody who heretofore wouldn't have called myself an activist or speaking, is because there is no both sides to this. We have thousands of Americans dying, and it's preventable. The thing that just drives me nuts as a journalist is when people say, well, stronger gun laws don't work. Look at New York, look at Chicago. But the context is missing. They're proximal to states that have very wide open gun laws. Virginia has long been known as a gun running state to New York. And I believe it's Indiana that is got lax gun laws that is enabling guns to filter into Chicago. Also, recently I was reading an article that guns are so easily accessible in the state of Texas, as Governor Abbott is proud to brag about, that now Mexican drug cartels are importing guns from the United States to arm their cartels in Mexico. This is where we are, people. I've got friends who are terrified to send their kids to school. I myself lately find myself like nervous to go to Trader Joe's. And whenever I go to a grocery store, I'm always looking who looks angry or upset, or somebody with a backpack, or maybe something that we shouldn't be living like this. Like, this is not freedom. This is not freedom. And I live in a huge military town, and people, really love their guns. But if you're in the military and you've been trained, that is the weapon of war that you are given. How an 18-year-old or anybody with any kind of anger management history is able to just roll up and get a weapon of war more easily than they can a six-pack of beer is insanity to me. And the sad thing about working in the news business for so long is it's like, oh, the death count has to be high enough for the news to cover it. I mean, shootings happen all day long, every day in Black and brown communities. They'll never make the news. But, 32 kids or 21 in Uvalde, yes, it's almost like, I feel in some ways, are we daring these people to go even bigger? Let the bloodbath get even bigger? It's sickening. It's sickening. I remember a couple years ago, my local church here was very proud to brag about the armed security guards they had. And I remember saying to one of the pastors, I'm like, there's a way that we could make church safer. It would be that if people didn't have such easy access to guns, that they could just walk in here on a Sunday morning and blow us all away during worship. And she looked at me and she said, yes, but don't you think, guns prevent that? I'm like, no, they actually don't. I don't remember ever showing up to a story in 20 years of reporting where somebody said, guess what? We have a story where this person with a gun prevented something bad from happening. It never goes that way. And the statistics prove us out that a gun in a situation with domestic violence, now that situation is deadly. All of the constant harping we hear from people who are so attached and in love with their guns about a good guy with a gun, that has done nothing for Buffalo. That man was a former police officer who lost his life. The Uvalde disaster is just ongoing. The horror of that, a platoon of armed police officers did nothing. Same thing at Marjorie Stoneman High. And I just think, like, at what point do we wake up collectively and say, this is an insane and crazy way to be living, where I'm afraid to go to church, or I'm, nervous about going into Trader Joe's. My girlfriend is nervous when she's at her daughter's recital. For a couple of years, I worked with special needs kids at an elementary school here. And I remember thinking every day, my worry was, okay, now what do I do when an active shooter comes in this building. How do I get these kids out of here? Because, you work with special needs kids, they don't always follow directions as easily. And I remember that just being a drumbeat, like knowing it's going to happen. This is the kind of nation we live in now. It's not freedom. Millions of us are stressed out being able to do basic errands, going to church. I think about the man going to buy a birthday cake for his son in Buffalo. We've heard from people on this filibuster, people from the Pulse nightclub, the hatred that is quite literally aimed at women, people in the Black and brown communities, at LGBTQ. It's hatred. And yes, we do need more resources for mental health, which have been consistently cut by the very people saying, and I'm talking to you politicians, those of you who are saying we need to address mental health, yeah, well, let's do it. Let's fund it. Let's stop cutting those resources. But in the meantime, let's look around at every single other peer nation in the world. Every single one of them, they do not have the problem that America does. It's a gun cult here. And yes, I do use the word gun cult. When people are more in love with their rights to have a gun than they are for the rights for the rest of us to be able to walk around and not be terrified, to drop our kids off to school or to relive moments of gun violence, if your right is more important than mine and my friends and our kids to live in a society where we don't have to be terrified of being mown down the way it was a week ago in DC, then this is not a free country. It's not. And I just think back to my dad, just to kind of bring this to a close, my dad who devoted his life to saving children, from all kinds of trauma and illnesses. And he just could never get his head around how somebody could possibly think that gun ownership or that easy access to firearms was more important than the lives of children. And he was also the one who told me that the Republicans had defunded the ability for the CDC to study gun violence for years, and that just drove him crazy because he's like, the information that we need, that we so desperately need, is now being frozen by certain politicians. And we know that, for 20 years, there was no federally funded gun research going on, and that just broke a couple years ago. But nothing has really changed. And for every person who comes at me saying the gun is my way of protecting myself, I'm like, is it really? I've been involved, as I've shared with you tonight, with several violent situations. I've been where there's been active gunfire in scenes. I've been held up at gunpoint. I watched a friend of mine hunted down and killed. She was pleading for her life. And I really don't know what else it's going to take to move the needle other than a rage and a fury from those of us who have been looking on the sidelines like we have to get out here. We know that the majority of Americans want common sense gun reform. And we have to keep saying common sense because this gun cult gets crazy and says, we're coming to take your guns. That's just not true. That is a lie. It's a lie. Nobody's coming to take your guns. And by the way, we have 400 million guns in this country, far more than we do people. I don't know how we could get them back. But I do know that America's fetish with guns is deeply troubling to my friends who live abroad. And I've traveled, a fair amount. And every time I leave this country, when I get out at Heathrow or Paris or wherever I happen to be, I always breathe a sigh of relief because in the back of my mind, I don't have to worry about going out into busy London, central London, or wherever I am. And there isn't this constant tape of like, be aware, at any moment, this situation could become the scene of a gun massacre, because all of these countries, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, Canada, they made changes to their laws. And as a result, we see that they do not have the gun massacres that we do. This is a uniquely American problem. And as somebody who has done live shot standing in human brain matter, which I know that sounds so awful to say, but I think that we have to explain that this is that awful. I think that we have to stop sanitizing what gun death looks like. I mean, all of these people who are insisting that they need to hold on to an AR-15, do you know what an AR-15 does to little children's bodies? They were mutilated. And that yet is still not enough. I mean, Senator John Cornyn is like being heckled on stage because people like us, like me, want to make it just a little more difficult for somebody who shouldn't have a gun to get one. And I have never understood the need for assault weapons. I live in, like I said, a huge military community. My ex was a SEAL Team 6 SEAL, and he didn't carry a gun to protect himself. He carried a knife. I mean, this machoism, gun cult, I've got to brag about an AR-15 assault rifle with a big bumper sticker on the back of my pickup truck. Like as I was coming back from DC, I was like, gosh, be careful. You just don't know. You might look at someone the wrong way, and there's a good chance that they'll shoot you, because this is this is the way that we live in this country, and it has to stop. So I just want to say, for all the situations I've been in, I've never felt the need to own a gun. As a woman who's faced down a gun, I've never felt that the answer to protecting myself was more guns. And I just want to show you guys a picture of my dad. He's in heaven now. That's my daddy, who devoted his life to saving children's lives. And he's been gone now for 3 years, but I want to make it part of my father's legacy to carry on his voice for doing everything we possibly can to make sure that we don't lose another friend, a family member, another school child who doesn't get to enjoy their summer days. And so I'm not asking, I am demanding change. Virginia's now gone back to a Republican legislature, so any gun reforms that the Democrats made are probably going to be rolled back. And the sad thing is that this should not be considered a political issue, but somehow it's been politicized. We all live here. Most gunmen, and they're mostly men, we know, don't enter into a place and ask, who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, who's an independent? Okay, you guys to decide, I'll just shoot you. It doesn't work that way. As for the question, when is enough enough? Apparently, we're just going to keep going until we get so enraged and we vote the people out who are not protecting us and our kids. And so I am asking for Congress. I'll tell you what, I don't vote for you. If you are on the gun lobby payroll, nuh-uh. And thank God the senators here in Virginia, Tim Kaine and Warner, have been very proactive about enacting gun legislation. But as long as we have this insane filibuster in Congress where it's going to take 10 additional people to pass any kind of gun law reform, I don't know. So I just pray, deeply pray, that if we're a nation that's going to call ourselves one that loves God in whatever form that is for you, let's love each other enough to say that my owning an assault weapon or an arsenal of guns is not more important than your life or your child's life. Now is the time. We've been saying it for so long. For 20 years, I've covered gun violence, and I'm just like, this is not the way to live. I've even thought sometimes about moving out of this country because of the gun violence threat. I don't want to have to go through any more days like I did last week in DC, where my PTSD is triggered and I see terrified parents covering their children. This is just not freedom. And so the time is now. I thank you for giving me the chance to speak here tonight and talk about all my different experiences. I'm grateful that I am here, but I want to speak up for my colleagues like Allison and Adam, who aren't. They're not here to tell their stories. So we have to be the ones speaking for them. And for those kids in Uvalde and the families in Buffalo and Sandy Hook and on and on and on and on it goes. We have got to demand change. And now is the time. Thank you very much. And God bless.